Good afternoon. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest in conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we're speaking, and Joshua, I always mess up your last name, I know, but today we're speaking with Joshua Ng.
That's right.
Did I get it right?
Yes, you did.
He's a director at Alton Aviation Consultancy in Singapore. Joshua, welcome back.
Welcome. Nice to meet you again, Matt.
Well, it's good to see you again. I think we've spoke first back in 2020, which seems like a long time ago, with the pandemic and everything else. And I think I also talked to one of your colleagues recently. Tell me what's happening with Alton Aviation right now.
Yeah, I think we have been growing, right, since the pandemic. We have done a lot of advisory work around the entire aviation value chain. I think in 2020, you would have imagined it was the COVID period. So there was a lot of work that we did around COVID restructurings, around airline and fleet strategies. But I think as we came out into the end of last year and into the beginning of this year, I think we're seeing a lot more long-term business growth projects where we're really looking at, investments for the future, whether it's acquisitions or whether it's just new aviation infrastructure developments.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of things going on. I want to talk about urban air mobility because Alton came out with a recent report. I think I don't know
That's right.
if you wrote the whole thing or if you were part of that or whatever. There's a lot happening in that sector. Tell us a little bit about the report and what you think about the sector in general.
Sure, Matt. So I think one of the first things, we don't really like to call it urban air mobility because there's that conception that is only around the city landscape. We like to call it advanced air mobility because it's many different things. It's fixed wing aircraft, it's vertical takeoff aircraft, it's electric aircraft, it's also hydrogen aircraft, right? So everything in between. So that's I guess the first comment that I have. I think when we look at the entire AAM sector, right, we saw about $8 billion of investments by various investor groups, whether they are venture capital firms, private equity, or even from industry players itself. We have seen about 12,000 orders so far for these aircrafts. So I think we are in a spot where the industry is ready to take off. There's serious commitment to funding. And there are some orders that are being placed. What we do recognize is that some of the OEMs do mention, a 2025 entry into service date. So that's about 2 years away from today. And one of the papers that we recently authored was around trying to understand what needs to happen in the next 2 years for the industry to get there, to get the first AAM vehicle flying in the skies.
Well, I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about everything. I mean, air taxis, talking about that. There's been, as you said, there's lots of things that needs to be done. There's air traffic control. There's regulatory issues, things like that. You mentioned 2025. I'm a little bit skeptical about that because. And again, you mentioned also that it's not just urban air taxis or anything else. It's something else. But most of the things that I see from companies like Eve, Volocopter, eHang, some of the other companies that are involved, they're talking about not using airports. Why use an airport? And they're talking about using parking garages as landing ports or vertiports. Or some other piece of ground that's closer to the city center and things like that. I mean, is 2025 a realistic number for these things to start happening?
I think when you see the entire AAM value chain and the pacing item around in the whole industry is around vehicle certification, right? I think we all recognize that building new technology is hard. Even existing technology like your 787 or the 350, they came out a bit later than what the manufacturers expect them to come out at. And I think you'll probably see the same in this space. A lot of the OEMs were actually promising 2024, but they have since delayed it by 2025 to 2025. I think what I can say is that at least from a certification point of view, we've seen the regulators, notably the EASA as well as the FAA, come out and publicly mention that they won't be the bottleneck for this space. So if we had to hazard a guess, it will be just trying to build the technology which will limit when the start date for the sector will be. And it is true that 2025 is sort of a milestone because it goes from 0 to 1, right, in a sense. But I always do think that the real milestone is when we can see a lot of these vehicles in the air, and that is not going to be 2025. It's probably going to be 2030 onwards, where you get a lot more OEMs with certified products. You have a lot more production of these vehicles, and you would then be in a position to actually fly in one of these vehicles in the 2030s.
Okay, let's talk about the autonomous part. Everybody talks about, you're going to be able to, you land at the airport in Tokyo, and then you hop on a urban air taxi or advanced air mobility vehicle, whatever you want to call it, that's powered by electric motors or powered by hydrogen or whatever, and you're going to fly to your destination in some other. I mean, Tokyo is a huge city, and you're gonna fly from Narita to some other place and be closer to your house and all of that. I like a pilot in the seat. I like two. I like two pilots actually. I prefer that. We've seen driverless cars. We've seen a few things that have happened with that. Not to pick on Elon Musk, but he's an easy target right now with Tesla. There's been lots of crashes, things like that. Do you really think people are going to get in a pilotless vehicle, punch in a destination code, put their American Express card in, and take off?
Yeah, I do think that if we think about technology, we need to think about the evolution, right? And that evolution also requires that the people, the public, accept that the vehicle is safe to fly, and that it will be able to get you from point A to point B. I think there are technologies or there are companies that are developing technologies to support that. And I think Wisk Aero is one of them, and they've recently gotten quite a sizable investment from Boeing. But I do think that we are going to go from two pilots, perhaps, in the commercial aviation space, to one pilot in the eVTOL. So the pilot is going to control the aircraft. Obviously, the avionics and the flight controls will help assist. And eventually, in the future, we might see autonomous travel. And I think it's going to be inevitable. We do need to figure out the kinks today for us to get there in the future.
Okay. Regional differences. Are there, we've got EHang in China. Volocopter has been doing a lot of work in Singapore. There's some other people working on drones in Singapore. Asia obviously is a very crowded place. Manila, Jakarta, Tokyo, Beijing, Shanghai. And again, Singapore seems to be making a lot of progress. Are there hot spots in Asia that you think will take the lead? Is Singapore going to take the lead, or are other cities going to vie for that place?
Yeah, I think leadership here, not necessarily refers to how big the use case is for the particular country. Singapore is a good example, right? The surface transportation here is fairly good. So the use cases in Singapore might not be as obvious, but certainly Singapore is trying to play a leadership role in trying to move the whole transportation infrastructure in a different direction. I think if you look at other Asian cities, Korea, Japan are also quite advanced in their thinking and about the using of eVTOLs and AAM in the city as well as the regional landscape. And then I think you'll definitely see it in other parts of Asia as well. Matt, because if you think about Asia, the geography actually plays very well to AAM. There's a lot of water in the way of traveling between cities. So countries like the Philippines and Indonesia will require eVTOLs or AAM vehicles to help in that regard. Asia also has a lot of congested cities. So you mentioned a few: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou in China, Philippines, in Manila, and Indonesia as well. They will also probably alleviate some of the road congestion that you see. And countries with just huge land masses, right, like India and China, I think the cargo application there would probably be very good because people are less densely situated around the country, and so having that ability to transport passengers or cargoes, small amounts of passengers and cargoes across relatively modest distance, I think would also work well in Asia.
Okay, Joshua, we need to take a quick break here. We're going to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're talking with Joshua Ng. He's a director at Alton Aviation in Singapore. Joshua, before the break, we were talking about air taxis. You deal with airports a lot. And we talked about this question a little bit before the break. Airports are not the right places to be putting urban air taxis or advanced air mobility vehicles or whatever. And again, people are talking about parking garages, building ceilings, which is where they have, you can land a helicopter on the top of a building now. Are we going to see a lot more of that? Are real estate developers looking to rent out the top of their building, the volocopter, for example?
Yeah, man, I think airports, at least in our view, airports will probably be an essential part of the transportation infrastructure, right? If you think about people traveling across, intercontinental distances, you need to get from your home or the office to the airport. And that's actually one of the use cases that we think on the passenger side will start first. There's a lot of demand on one end, which is the airport. And you could also have a lot of demand on the other end, especially if it's around the business district, for example. It makes it increases the utilization of the aircraft. It helps lowers costs. So I think there's a strong proposition to have AAM vehicles flying into and around the airport locations. I think if you look at where the aircraft has to fly into the city, then if you look at a lot of the major metropolitan cities, which are already very well developed and very densely populated, we do expect that some of this infrastructure has to be repurposed, right, for AAM usage, and we do think that parking garages or the top of buildings could potentially be options for such vertiports. You can also think about locations on the river, for example, or elsewhere where you could land a vehicle safely, and that does not kind of impede the surface movement in and around the vicinity of the vertiport as well.
Okay. Well, I kind of want to stick with this topic because it's interesting, and we're going to talk about sustainability, and this question is about sustainability. There's a lot of there's a company, I forget where, but it's maybe in the Philippines or Indonesia. I can't remember which company, but they've got electric motorcycles, electric scooters, and basically you sign up for a service, your battery runs low, you pull up to one of these battery stations, and you switch out the battery, put another battery in your scooter, swipe your membership card or whatever, and off you go. Are AAM vehicles, is it going to be that same kind of thing? Or, because I talked to someone the other day, and they said, no, you're not going to be able to just swap out the batteries. It's going to have to be, you're going to have to charge it up for a certain amount of time and things like that. Technically, what do you see happening in that area?
I think it really depends on how the OEMs are conceiving the whole charging infrastructure. I think you'll see some of the OEMs go for a battery swapping a method, which is what you mentioned earlier. But I think most of the other OEMs are thinking more of a plug-in solution where you're plugging into the electricity grid, and thereby you're charging for charging up the batteries in the vehicles. It's not to say that those batteries are not removable. It's just not removable between each and every flight. A mechanic will probably need to do some of that work.
Right, so there'll be some MRO involved a little bit on all that. What about hydrogen? Does that have a role to play in AAM?
Yeah, I think so. And I think hydrogen is one of the concepts that the aviation industry is adopting. I think you'll agree with me, Matt, that it's going to be a bit further out in terms of getting us there. There's a lot more unknowns and a lot more infrastructure that needs to be developed and processes that needs to be thought out to support hydrogen. But I think we will eventually get there. I think one thing that I take to heart was the recent two demonstration vehicles by Zero Avia as well as Universal Hydrogen, where they demonstrated that it was possible to run an aircraft on hydrogen power.
Well, actually, I mean, I point this out in every story I write. The former Soviet Union actually did a hydrogen-powered plane back in the 1980s, I think it was.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these technologies, if you think about it, are not necessarily new, but the amount of effort and the amount that where technology is today has just progressed to a point where it actually makes economical sense from an operator perspective to actually consider the usage of electric or hydrogen vehicles.
Okay, well, a lot of your clients are airports, and let's stick with sustainability a little bit. I think the aviation industry, and I've said this many times, it gets a bad rap when it comes to global emissions. What are you seeing in terms of SAF and what airports are doing to get ready for SAF? And what are they telling you about sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's different for different parts of the value chain. When you look at the airports, a lot of the emissions come from Scope 3, which is the emissions that are not directly or indirectly related to the airport operations. So it's really attributable to the airlines, the landing and takeoff cycle. It's also in the travel of employees to and from their workplaces to their homes. So those are things that are not exactly controllable by the airports itself. So when we look at the airlines, however, then because they affect the landing and takeoff is part of their own Scope 1 emissions, right? And is attributable to the airports from a Scope 3 perspective, then I think the levels there, I think it's quite aligned in terms of if the airlines are able to improve their fuel efficiency or to reduce their CO2 emissions, then, the entire aviation industry will be able to decarbonize at a much quicker pace. I think when we look at it, right, like it is true that you might need new solutions to help decarbonize. But I think one of the things that actually can be quite readily done is around just adopting the newer generation aircraft. So by using a 320neo, for example, compared to a 320ceo, you'll probably have at least a 12 to 15% fuel efficiency, a benefit, which also reduces the CO2 emissions by probably as much as the equivalent amount as well. So there are ways to decarbonize today, and there are of course other ways to decarbonize, right? If you think about having better flight paths to reduce fuel consumption, and having more efficient ground operations, for example, those are also additional ways to decarbonize. But we do have to look at future technologies like electric aviation or hydrogen aviation for us to get there as well.
Well, and it's interesting to me. There's no huge magic bullet out there, like you just said. I mean, it's these incremental steps about using. You get a 10%, decrease in fuel burn from a certain engine or an engine part. It's things like that where it's more of step by step, and there's no magic bullet that's going to solve the whole problem.
I think you're right in that regard. There's no silver bullet, there's no magic bullet here. But I think each of these individual steps do add up, and they can have quite significant impact. So we do need to ensure that we get from a very novel or perhaps emerging technology to something that is more that is proven and well adopted by industry for us to bank all the CO2 savings there.
Quick question for airports. I mean, we talked about airports and airlines. For airports, it seems like it's easier to go green because they're not burning engines or anything like that, and they can put in solar panels on their roofs. They can recycle water. They can do this. They can do that. But for airlines, it's a lot harder. Would you agree with that?
I think that will be correct kind of categorization. But I think one other thing I'd like to just point out is the fact that if we decide that the world needs SAF or electricity or hydrogen to power these aircraft, I think airports still have to play quite a big role, because they need to provision for the energy infrastructure for these different types of fuels. So you could think of perhaps having to set up something with the electricity grid to have the electrical power, sufficient power to charge all the aircraft that require the electricity. Or you need to provision for hydrogen silos, right? Fuel farms, for example. And that's a very different kind of proposition from just using jet A fuel today.
Yeah, I want to ask you a quick question, and then we're almost out of time, so I need to get to the last question. But a quick question is, I mean, it seems like the governments, the regulatory agencies, whether it's Europe, whether it's the U.S., whether it's China, whether it's Singapore, pick a region, sometimes they seem to me, and I used to work for government back in the U.S., so I have a lot of knowledge about this. Are governments on board? Are they keeping up to date with all of these things? Are they in favor of all of this, or is the aviation industry having trouble convincing the regulators that this is a good thing, that SAF is a good thing and it's safe and it's all of that? I mean, how is the regulation part going?
Yeah, I don't think the regulation here around the use of new technology is a roadblock. I think there are policies that try to implement these new technologies, and different countries have different standards. I think if you look at China, I think they are trying to go to net zero by 2060, and India is going to net zero by 2070. So there's a difference in opinion on when to get there. But I think collectively the governments recognize that we need to get there because of the climate change impact that aviation and the rest of the industries have on all of us.
Yeah, and again, I think aviation gets a bad rap because apparently the concrete industry has more CO2 emissions than aviation does, but that's another argument for another time.
Yeah.
Joshua, finally, I always like to end these things on a positive note. What do you say? We've just come out of the pandemic. people are flying. Like my wife just took a flight today from Cambodia. I'm in Cambodia. She flew to Singapore. Plane was packed. When I came back from Singapore a few weeks ago, the plane was packed. I mean, people are flying. People are buying tickets. Ticket prices are high, but people are flying. What's the positive part of the industry that you see coming the next 6 months, the next year?
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned at the beginning of today's conversation, I think in 2023 we are starting to kind of leave the COVID pandemic behind. This year we are forecasting that travel will get back to where we are in 2019. So that gives the entire aviation industry a boost. It gives people, the stakeholders, that breathing space where they can focus on the future. And especially in the area of sustainability as well. I think the other thing that I'm quite heartened and I'm looking forward to understand is around what I would term new aviation, right? What's the future going to be like? And we talked about AAM in great detail, and the different types of technologies that will come with it. And we're going to move away from prototypes to actually possibly, pre-production kind of activities, and that's very interesting, and looking forward to hopping on a plane, a new aviation type plane, in the very near future.
I look forward to that too. Joshua Ng, Director at Alton Aviation in Singapore, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt.